So good morning. The future of work. Well, I'm going to step back a little bit, actually, and share with you some reflections on the role of business, because I think, actually, that is going to determine the future of work. And I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons. One, I think that there has been a very long-held, valid assumption that business plays a fundamental role in society, that economic growth delivers good things to society, and therefore business is a good thing. And by definition, therefore, that will determine the future of work. The problem is that that's a serious question now, right? As we all know in this room, the implications for society of business are less and less clear. And actually, I think that societal expectations are going to determine not just the future of work, but frankly, the future of business. And so what I'm going to share with you are some reflections on this topic that we've been working on for some time, and in particular some reflections that we have shared with and for a group called the T20, which is a group commissioned by the G20 to provide policy input recommendations to allow the G20 formulate propositions in their countries and connected together for regulation, for policy, and so the rules of our game, if you like. So I said that there is a basic underlying premise which has sustained for decades that economic growth delivers social progress. This chart shows you a picture of economic growth measured in GDP terms for the world since 1980. That is a remarkably consistent story of significant growth over that period, probably more than any other time in history, and its implications have been extraordinary. We have seen hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people lifted out of poverty in that period. Economic growth has improved the quality of lives of practically everybody on the planet, right? Extraordinary, more than at any other time in history, an extraordinary achievement. And that economic growth has been underpinned by a very intentional framework put in place, particularly after the Second World War, largely to focus on rebuilding economies and societies which were destroyed in that process, principally in Europe and in Asia. And there were three key drivers which underpinned that framework. The first was globalization, so a very intentional institutional framework to facilitate and drive economic activity in and between countries on an increasingly global basis, actually, as time went on. The second is financialization. It was the recognition that the measurement of success of an economy in financial terms provides the fuel, not only at macro level, but also at micro level, at business level. And so that emphasis on financial performance, a very intentional element of that framework. And last but not least, continuous innovation and technological progress over the period, influencing and fueling the whole system. Those three things have worked marvelously well over that period. And there's a phrase I like to use which describes the logic which underpins that, which is that we had an economic engine in play for many decades, very successfully designed to meet human needs, and in doing so, to match those with human opportunities. So there was an intrinsic link between economic performance, business performance, and outcomes which were both acceptable but also very positive in societal or social terms. And yet, today, we find ourselves with a massive erosion in trust. We have huge proportions of our societies either concerned or deeply fearful about globalization, about eroding social values, about immigration, about technological progress. We see and feel and hear this all the time, and it's very clearly fueling a really anxious, really concerning political dynamic in many of our countries. So how did we get to the point where we've such a disconnect has arisen from a framework that was actually designed to create this connection between business and society, and very successfully so? In fact, so successful was that dynamic that in 1989, a guy called Francis Fukuyama actually suggested that we had reached the end of history. In other words, that we had perfected the model within which we all operated. So something fundamental happened to create this huge mistrust, these political tensions, this sense of dissatisfaction. And actually 1989 was probably quite a pivotal year in that context, because remarkably, it was probably the year around which a very substantive change in the nature of these three drivers began to take place. Each of these three drivers began to change, not only in their own right, but actually in their compound effect. In other words, they began to work on each other in ways which had not been anticipated and had not been planned for. And in particular, they began to produce outcomes which had not been planned for and which I think we are dealing with today. So we had global trade exploding. We had global businesses operating, actually for the first time, in a truly global environment, underpinned by technology, which enables global businesses to operate in a way disaggregating supply chains, locating functions around the world, which hadn't happened previously. The internet exploded from the early 90s onward, facilitating that, and in turn created a truly global financial system for the first time. So it's a period of massive change. It cannot be overstated the degree to which these changes in these three drivers literally changed the world that we live and work in that period. Just to give you a sense of the scale of that, and these I'm sure you'll be familiar with, but the scale of inward investment, largely from developed markets and into developing markets, was enormous in that period. And look when it started, really took off in the early 90s. The growth in the E7 economies is enormous in that period. In 1995, E7 were less than half of the G7 in terms of economic scale. By 2015, they're about equal. And by 2040, at current rates, you could have the E7 double the size of the G7. That is a staggering change within that time frame. It fundamentally changes the context within which business operates and its implications for the societies and communities around the business. The financial economy I mentioned earlier, equally significant change at two different levels. One, I talked earlier about the fact that you have financial performance as the underpin for measurement of success, both at macro level, GDP is essentially a financial measure of performance for a country, and at micro level for businesses. We all know that shareholder value is a critical driver. That evolution to have an emphasis on shareholder value was significant over that period, but technology fundamentally changed and accelerated that dynamic. And so you had a massive growth from the early 90s onwards, for example, in the degree of high frequency and therefore short-term trading, which completely changed the dynamic between what's the purpose of the financial performance and over what period. And it's interesting to look at the implications of those changes, the outcomes which they had then from a broader societal perspective. Sometime during the 80s, and this is a chart reflecting what happened in the US, sometime during the 80s, productivity and hourly wage rates began to diverge. But you can see that that really took off in the early 90s and beyond. And that gap looks like it continues to widen. And you can pick almost any country that you wish, and you could pick social statistics of one kind or another, which kind of bring to life that gap that I've just described. The one on the right, and these again come from the US, is really pretty stark, right? So the participation rate for white working class males fell from 87% in 1948 to about 59% now. So that's 40% of that community is not participating in the workforce. That is an extraordinary statistic. And you could pick equivalent statistics for most of the countries that we live and work in, particularly in Europe, for example, particularly Southern Europe, when you look at younger segments of the population and their labour participation rates. But this chart actually probably captures best the overall global picture. This is called the elephant chart. You can see the shape of the elephant and the trunk. Right? And it's a picture which describes the levels of increase in income for different percentiles of the global population over the 20-year period from the late 80s. Right? And effectively on the left-hand side of the chart, sort of grey piece, you have the population in the developing markets who by and large have had reasonably significant increases in their income levels over that period, except for the very bottom. The middle piece, the developed, is essentially the place where you have the working and middle class in the developed world. And as you can see over that period, you largely had either stagnation or reversals in income levels over that period. And at the extreme right, you have the very small and privileged 1% who also managed, by definition, typically from the developed markets, to keep their incomes growing in that period. And so while we have enormous overall progress, on average at a global level, we have a very mixed picture when you break it down in this way, in social terms. And it's really not surprising, therefore, that we have this degree of mistrust in a system, particularly on the part of those who haven't benefited from the framework that I've just described. So we have 2 of the 4 institutions now effectively mistrusted on balance, media and government. But actually NGOs and business are only barely over the 50%, and in both cases, in all 4 cases, trust levels continue to fall. And actually, I've just described for you the picture of how we have got to where we are, right? I haven't touched on yet the topics that you have been discussing for much of the last 24 hours or so, which are what's coming next. What's technology going to do to this mix? Well, we already know that the views, for example, coming back from our CEO survey will tell us that bots are going to replace humans, businesses are not planning to hire more humans by and large, et cetera, et cetera. So the dynamic which technology is going to play is going to become more profound, more fundamental over the next 5, 10, 15 years and so on. The world is aging, which means that many countries are going to suffer from serious demographic challenges on top of this mix. And absent a change in this dynamic, in this overall framing of how the system operates, trust will continue to erode. So I think we face some pretty serious challenges when we then think about the future of business, the role of business in society, what society will give business as a mandate, and by definition, therefore, the future of work. And the social and political reaction to this dynamic may not be surprising, but it's really troubling because it's essentially a reaction of rejection. And we see this all around the place. So when we've had big surprises, in inverted commas, in Brexit, with Trump, and that dynamic continuing in many other countries, it's essentially a rejection, right? So it's a rejection of globalization, but it's a rejection of a global interdependent reality. It's a rejection of technological development, but technological development will continue. That progress will not stop. And it's by definition a rejection of a deeply mistrusted financial system. The problem with that rejection and the dynamic which it feeds in political terms is that it's very likely that it will make outcomes even worse for those who are most disaffected, most negatively impacted. That's the real concern, which of course will feed a more negative political dynamic. But we should be clear, for the reasons that I've described, the current system isn't functioning effectively, and it does need to change. And we did have a system intentionally designed to use the economic engine to deliver human outcomes on a sustainable, acceptable basis. We need to get back to realigning that mix, to realigning business, economies, and therefore societies. It really feels like we've reached a bit of a fork in the road. How do we draw a picture of the future where we, as business, can contribute to that realignment? Well, there are some observations and maybe some comments that I would share as a matter of reflection, right? So first of all, the 3 drivers, globalization, financialization, and technology, they're essentially rejected, as I said earlier, in the political response to the dynamic that I've described. But there is an inherent duality as we describe this. There is a global interdependent reality. But that global system has to deliver to local communities. Otherwise, it's not recognizing the issues that need to be addressed. And so we need to think about framing the system in a way which recognizes and leverages that global reality, but does so for local benefit. We know that financial performance is an inherent and actually human part of an economic system, of a market system. So it has to be embedded. But actually, it can't be the only measure of success, either at macro level or indeed for business. And last but not least, we know that technology will continue to progress, but we need to ensure that technology is specifically and intentionally used to meet human needs with and for humans, rather than something which disconnects humans or makes humans intentionally redundant. So there are some observations in that context that can be drawn from the analysis that I've just shared with you. The first one, this is a big challenge. Economic growth, as currently measured, is not always benign. That is a fundamental challenge to economic orthodoxy which has existed for the last 70 years at least. That is very challenging to respond to, and because it requires a reframing of how economic policy is formulated and what it's designed to do. Related to that, average or overall success or progress isn't good enough. When we measure economic progress and when we measure societal outcomes as a consequence, it's not good enough to say that on average we're doing great, because on average actually we are doing great. But in a divergent system, too many people get left behind, and that's not good enough. Almost by definition, you have to target specific outcomes to address human issues, and you have to do that at a local level. And that means that you have to go beyond GDP at a macro level, and you have to go beyond just shareholder value at a business level. You have to use our engine to focus on human needs and human outcomes at a local level as well as at a global level. And those targets need to be bespoke, in other words, relevant for the communities for which they're targeted. They need to be prioritized, and they need to be sequenced, because not everything can be done at the same time, and all countries are different. That's one of the other misassumptions which underpins economic thinking. It is that we can apply this engine to deal with a whole range of different issues which are actually fundamentally different in different countries, culturally, historically, reality, and so on. Reporting and transparency, again, at a country level and at a business level, has to evolve to reflect that changed framework that I've just described. It has to evolve beyond GDP and beyond shareholder value, and it has to do so for both countries and for businesses. I talked about the fact that we know globalization is unavoidable, and so that has to be embedded in the thinking. You cannot keep boundaries, national boundaries, on climate change, on cybersecurity, on disease, on migration, by definition. A word on technology. Technology is intrinsically indifferent to its impact on people. Right? It's neither inherently good nor is it inherently bad. And there are people who are in both camps as they profess either state or the other. That's not true. But that does mean that technology can and should be used in an intentional way to deliver or to address human needs. It's perfectly possible to do so. And in fact, when it is done in that intentional way, technology offers the opportunity for us collectively to make huge further progress, to address needs that aren't even capable of being considered at the moment. It also means, however, that a significant number of entirely new jobs have to be created. A colleague of mine calls this the funnel of new tasks that need to be imagined and need to be planned for. Because we're going to have to redefine what we mean by work, as technology literally supplants many of the tasks that we currently focus on. And what I've described requires essentially a systematic reframing of the institutional framework that was put in place to make the business, to make the economy work in the way that it has very successfully for the last 70 odd years. That just now needs to be replumbed, to be redesigned for the world that we now live in, to address the issues that we're now all deeply familiar with. And that can't be done in isolation, and it can't be done in silos. This is one of my concerns. Business generally talks about, I wish government would do that. Government generally talks about, I wish business would do the other. That community has to come together to address these kinds of issues. There has to be a much higher degree of collaboration between business and policymakers to address these really fundamental concerns. I hope that's one of the messages you will take from this room. So let me go back to the future of work topic. Let me just frame what I've described to you in a way which maybe suggests that there are some observations which also flow from what I've described in the context of the specific theme of the conference. So we know this, right? We know that technology is going to continue to run riot around the world. We know it's going to continue to have profound implications for all of us, for all of our workforces. But actually, I think in order to begin to address the question of, well, what do we do about it? How do I, as a business leader, begin to respond to that? There are some pretty fundamental questions about your business that you need to reflect on first, right? I think the first I would suggest is to really think hard about what need you meet as a business. What purpose is your business designed to serve? That question becomes much more fundamental in an environment which is dynamic as the one that I've described. And I would suggest to you that a lot of businesses focus on trying to ensure that they prepare their current operations, their workforce, to do in a more efficient or different way or a transformed way what they have always been doing. And clearly that's necessary, but I worry a lot that that's not enough. And in fact, that's a mistake. Because unless you also anticipate the need that you expect to meet as a business in the future, and you plan to organize your workforce to respond to that need, you're simply going to find yourself with a very efficient workforce doing something which is no longer relevant. So as you plan to focus on your future need, that should set the framework for your future definition of your future tasks. How do you stay relevant in a world which is changing as fast as it is? And by definition, therefore, how do you prepare your current workforce, and how do you plan for your prospective workforce as a consequence? I heard a great quote about 2 weeks ago, which described for me the essence of a lot of this. The suggestion was that we need to think not about protecting jobs, but about protecting workers. That's a really nice way of saying that actually we can't think about roles any longer. We have to think about tasks. We have to think about who's going to do the task. We have to think about the role which technology will play in tasks. And is technology going to supplant the task? Is technology going to work with humans? Or are there tasks where you have human-centered tasks only, human-centered skills only? And you have to build your skill set and plan for your workforce to have that skill set as a consequence of that dynamic. That is a critical message, in my view, actually, for governments. Protect workers, not jobs. Don't try and protect jobs which are redundant. Protect people by giving them the skills to anticipate how they're going to participate in economies of the future. So these questions, I think, become reasonably obvious. I'm not going to spend too much time on them because they flow from the logic that I've just described to you. What skills are required now, but actually more particularly, how do you anticipate the skills of the future in the context of your business and the future needs that you will meet? This one is important. And it's a reflection of my emphasis or my suggestion that governments and businesses need to work more closely together. How do you feel about the skills that are coming into the system from the education system in your countries, which are available to you to do what you need to do as a business? I think there's increasing concern, we would have it, that actually something fundamental needs to change in the education system to better prepare people to be able to participate in the economies of the future. That's a conversation that business has to have with government. Our own workforces are going to have to be engaged with in order to have this conversation. I feel a huge responsibility to be more proactive about engaging with the 45,000 odd people who work in tax, because our people are smart. Who is your workforce? Look, I'm not going to dwell on that. I suspect you're well more versed than I am in that, but it's a question that has to be on the list. How do you motivate and reward that workforce? And how do you begin to take steps today to address those challenges of the future? And I would emphasize that one. I think you have to really think carefully, not only about how you transform current workforce to do what you currently do, you've got to think about what your business is going to be doing in the future as a consequence of these kinds of changes. So a quick word on our journey. I should shine the light on ourselves. How do we address these kinds of issue? Well, our purpose statement is to build trust in society and to solve important problems. That's not something that we use as a tagline. It's not something that we brand. It's not something that you see, I hope, in airports around the place, because it's an exercise that we undertook because we felt really deeply that in a dynamic world like this, we better be clear how we can answer that question internally and externally. And we better be clear that we use it to guide our decisions. Why do I say that? Well, we've always felt implicitly that our job and the reason we are a successful business is because the work that we do has contributed to a functioning of the systems which we advise on, whether it's tax systems, capital markets, whether it's the functioning of businesses in economies. And in doing so, that depends on how trusted we are. But in an environment where we are less trusted than before, along with many other businesses, in an environment where those systems that we advise on and help function themselves are less trusted and where they're under strain, this forces us to think quite hard about what we do, how we do it, and of course, why we do it. It forces us to think not only about the conversation I've just shared with you, but what's our responsibility to participate in that conversation and maybe contribute to that conversation with a view to making things better rather than worse. And it's a journey that we have made very considerable efforts to take along with our people. So we asked our people about our values. We asked them, what do you think? And we surveyed all 230,000. And I think I'm right in saying that we got about 130,000 engagements from our people on foot of that question. And the reason for that is obvious. We need our people to understand why we need to address these issues, and we need them to come on the journey with us and feel that that's a sincere conversation that we're having with them. It's also a reflection of what drives us to have the conversation with the T20 that I described earlier. If we're not taking our responsibility to address these kinds of issues seriously, and if we're not stepping up to engage with policymakers and governments when they come together in a forum like the T20, then I think we're not fulfilling our purpose. I hope that you will hold us to account to continue to do so, and maybe I'd ask you to think about coming on the journey with us. So, what I've described is pretty fundamental, right? It's not a small or a simple or a trivial endeavor to embark on the journey of rewiring the economic system that we participate in. We're pretty clear that is what is necessary, and equally clear that it requires an enormous degree of collaboration between governments and businesses in particular, with, I hope, increasing numbers of businesses recognizing the scale and importance of what I've just described, and I think that is true, and then beginning to participate in conversations about how to address these issues. But I'd also say that it requires a sense of hope and optimism, which is very often missing from the discourse, a sense of ambition and determination to address these issues. I feel quite strongly about this because people are deeply concerned and anxious about this framework, really concerned and worried, and with good reason. But actually the construct that we work in is a construct of human design, right? So it was a very intentional framework which was put in place, as I said, after the Second World War. I'm very confident that we can redesign the framework. I'm very confident that we can make things better, but it does need that ambition and determination to fuel that journey, and it does need to be credible and sincere in order to help people feel better about a future which at the moment sounds and feels quite troubling. And that principle of realigning the current system to focus on the alignment between business, economies and societies is a good way to trigger that conversation. So I hope that was useful. I hope it wasn't too scary. I realize that it's challenging. It should be optimistic. We should be ambitious as we set out to do this, and it will have profound implications for the future of work. So, Gavin, I'm very happy to take any questions.
That was great. We've already got some coming in, so please send some, some more in on the Spot Me app, and also I will ask you to put your hand up and ask a question the old-fashioned way in a moment, which is always the scariest moment. Just one of the big picture things. I mean, I thought that was really interesting and very challenging. In terms of trust, some of those trust researchers I've looked at say what people dislike about business, big business, is what they call, the researchers, an egocentric profit motive. In other words, it's fine to make a profit, but it's all about shareholder value and those metrics that you were talking about that we have used. So, but how can you, in your business, redefine it to say, yeah, these are the profits that have been made, this is, EBITDA and all that sort of stuff, but this is what we do for a wider society? I mean, do you think that's necessary, or do you think it's even possible?
Yeah, I think it's both, actually. And I think some businesses are beginning to make real progress on addressing those kinds of issues. So let me give you a very concrete example. There's a lot of work has been done on bringing environmental impact into financial reporting and financial statements and transparency. And a lot of the companies which have begun to do that have begun to focus on using the Sustainable Development Goals to do so, right? So very clear language, very clearly agreed right around the world. And businesses are beginning to say, okay, we're going to address that, we're going to take it seriously, and we're going to report on our impact. And in fact, we're going to begin to think about measuring in financial terms the implications of environmental change on our business, so that we actually have a more fundamental financial picture of a broader set of impacts. And to me, that's a good example of how you can begin to internalize broader implications into a business, even if you use the traditional financial framework that we currently have. So let me add one piece of momentum to that. The other side of the equation is that pressure on shareholder value has very often been driven by an investor community, in some cases an invisible investor community focused on high-frequency trading. But there are increasing large-scale investors who are saying to boards, we want to know what you're doing about the sustainability of our investment in your business. And that sustainability is going to be a function of how well you are dealing with not just your short-term financial performance, but a much broader range of broader stakeholder and societal issues. So tell us what you're doing. So the pressure can be brought to bear in a range of different ways. And as always, there are some businesses which are beginning to step up and say, this is the right thing to do, and it's the right thing to do for business. And that maybe, Gavin, is a good way to emphasize the import of what I'm saying. What I'm describing is not bad for business. In fact, it is essential for business success, right?
Because some CEOs will say, what's in this for me? I mean, I'm going to be judged by every 3 months by how much money I'm making effectively.
And I think that's, so let's be clear, right? That's true. There are many CEOs have been fired for not delivering on the short-term financials because that's where the pressure from the investors and the board comes from. And that will continue. So let's not be naive about the importance of delivering on the financials. I think there are increasing numbers of investors who are beginning to think that the sustainability of their investment requires a longer-term view, and that longer-term view has to take into account a broader range of KPIs, for want of a better word, than has historically been the case. So it's the beginnings of the rewiring of the system.
Let me put a couple of questions that have just come in. Where do we as a society even begin to redesign the construct within which we work so that it's fit for the future? And somebody else is saying, what practical steps do we need to do for the next 3 years to prepare for this? Because this is very thought-provoking, but many of us will just go, my goodness, this is so big, how can we deal with it?
Yes, so I think there are some very practical things. I think first of all, there is a task description of the activities that are undertaken by your business that you need to get a handle on to understand which ones are going to be impacted by technology in which way, and which ones are going to be human-centric, and how are you going to get the skills to do that. So there's what have you got, what do you need, and how are you going to organize yourself to be able to do that. Right? And there's a series of things which flow from that. How are you going to engage, how are you going to communicate, how are you going to do the analysis. I think beyond that, there is a real challenge, I think, that businesses underestimate, not only, as I said earlier, to understand the task process of what they currently do, but to anticipate where their business is going to be in the future, because technology changes the needs which customers are going to want. So there's two legs to that. And I think the third thing is, there is a conversation needed about your ability as a business to both get those skills and also to participate in a broader sense with governments. And I think being prepared to step up and have that conversation in the countries within which you operate about skills, about your role, about your contribution, about what you're trying to achieve, about what the country needs, be ready for that conversation, because I think that is going to become more urgent as a consequence of the dynamic we've talked about. So some very concrete, specific things from a business perspective that I think can and should be done urgently, and there's a more systemic conversation that businesses need to prepare for.
Colm, thanks very much.
Okay. Thanks.